The war in Ukraine has actually been going on since 2014, when Russia initially invaded Crimea and conquered Crimea. Has been occupying it since 2014, and since then there has been a ongoing war of attrition in the provinces of the Donbass that have large communities of ethnic Russians who are formed separatist movements. So since 2014, the estimate is around 14,000 people who have died in this war, continued war. So from the point of view of Ukraine and Russia, this war has been going on. What currently happened is an escalation in the war, and that is associated with a few different factors, but also a factor of kind of surprise, because many analysts did not expect for this to actually happen. It seemed like it was a threat that wouldn't materialize, that was used as a negotiating card, and that a Russian invasion of Ukraine with a purpose of potentially occupying or getting to Kiev, to the capital, was unlikely. So there was, on the one hand, we had intelligence information, at least that's what we heard from the American government, that this was in the plan, that this was going to happen, but it seemed unbelievable, and partly it seemed unbelievable because there didn't seem to be a rational reason for Russia to do this. There didn't seem to be any sort of potential upside from the Russian point of view. So when we'd analyze it from a Russian perspective, would Russia invade? Would Russia really dedicate this much forces to an actual ground, maybe 20th century style war in the 21st century? Kind of seemed nuts to observers that would happen because of the economic cost, the cost in life, the cost in reputation, how it would potentially escalate. Russia has not done anything like this before, so it didn't seem likely that this would happen. What led to this war in kind of a larger context that is also important, I think, to note is a slow and very noticeable decline of U.S. power and a rise in more great power, or countries that would like to think of themselves as great power, rivalry. We've seen more friction in some of the alliances between the United States and Europe, for example, in recent years. And that has led to an opening of more, we can call it potentially bold moves of balancing by other countries as part of this. There's the human global repercussions of the refugees that we're seeing, and that is true for any war, every war. A lot of wars that sometimes are off our radar because they're not televised or we're not present there in that same way. But refugees are, and displacement of people, both internally and externally, is a consequence of every single war, including civil wars. So that's one. The second one is the economic repercussions that we are already feeling, mostly because these are two countries that are major, Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of wheat and oil. We're seeing that one of the tools in the toolbox of foreign policy is economic sanctions that has been used this time in a way that it wasn't used before. And that means that anytime we really want economic sanctions if we want to try to implement economic sanctions in a way that there's a possibility that they would work, and most of the time economic sanctions don't really work the way that those who are sanctioning want them to, although these are different, so they might. But anytime we do that, we also have to take a hit, those who are implementing the sanctions, because the world economy is integrated. It's interconnected. So there has to be a will for this to have an impact. And for the first time, the sanctions are so, that were also, people were taken by surprise by how severe the sanctions are, which means that the countries, the United States, for example, has to be willing to deal with maybe higher oil prices, in Europe even more. So it's harder on the part of Europe, Western European countries, and especially Germany that trades more with Russia. We'll see what impact this has on wheat prices, on bread. But economic impact, global impact, goes both ways, because every war, there's also those who make a lot of money off of the war. So we tend to talk about the negative impact and how we're feeling it, how kind of regular people are feeling it, when we're going and putting gas in our car, and potential higher prices. This can exacerbate inflation, trade. Again, for the U.S. less so, because we're not exposed. We don't have a huge trading partnership with Russia to begin with. But there's also a lot of gains to be made. And those higher prices that we're seeing when there's shortages of certain commodities, like oil, for example, in part are because the big corporations are passing their higher costs onto consumers. Those corporations are actually profiting from the war. We see this in every single crisis. We saw this in COVID, for example, also, that there were those who actually benefited from the crisis. Military corporations, contractors, and big oil corporations actually might be benefiting from this financially. This is something important to look at, because there's an opportunity there to shine a light on these corporations who are actually who are passing the cost, or who are using the crisis in order to beef up their profits. That is actually connected to the third set of big global repercussions, which is the security ones. We always have these actors in these sort of wars that are pushing for more intervention, that are pushing for more for the reasoning that they give of security concerns, for more weapons, for countries to step in. We're hearing a lot of a push that is requested by Ukraine, but also then also followed with pressure by certain American policymakers and elected officials that are calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. A no-fly zone means that somebody has to enforce. You don't just say to the Russians, okay, there's a no-fly zone, you can't fly your airplanes or put your missiles over Ukraine. It doesn't happen like this. It needs to be enforced. And so by enforcing it, it means that the United States or NATO aircraft and military personnel would be in direct contact with Russia, and that can escalate very quickly into a much bigger war with unintended consequences, or with consequences that we don't know yet what they could be. So far, the United States and NATO has set these lines where they are very wary and very cautious of intervening, but one of the repercussions is that security repercussions. For me, as a political scientist who studies this, I think an important and very interesting consequence of this war is whether it will, the way in which it will impact the global order, the global international order that started after World War II with the creation of the United Nations, and that even enhanced after the Cold War.